I would just like to say a few words. Norman is standing down after 30 years in local and assembly politics. And thank you, Norman, for your dedication and promoting all your kind words towards the people and the heritage of Portrush. So thank you very much. So just a very brief safety message, and I apologize, some of you have heard this before. In the unlikely events of having to evacuate this room, please leave in an orderly manner. Don't run or push, and follow the instructions from committee members or members of the hotel staff. And there are two main exit routes. First is the main doors, the door that you came in. Just retrace your steps, go through the foyer, and go across and assemble in Antrim Gardens. And the second is through the emergency door, exit door on the rear right. Just follow the corridor round to the right and exit through a door at the end into the car park. Then make your way into Mark Street and turn right to assemble again in Antrim Gardens. And we'll do a head count at that point. Finally, in terms of messages, toilets are available outside the main doors of this room. Just turn left. And finally, please ensure that all mobile devices are turned off or on silent. Thank you for that. Now, I'd just like to say a few words about Natasha. I'd like to ask our Deputy Chairman, John Moore, to make a presentation to a great sponsor and supporter of the Heritage Group, that is Natasha Garrett, the General Manager of Portrush Atlantic Hotel. Natasha, we've said it on many occasions and I'll say it again. We would not be in the healthy state we are in without the support of Natasha and the Atlantic Hotel. The use of this suite and also the various conference rooms in the hotel is something Natasha has provided without hesitation or indeed charge. Natasha has also sponsored our events. You are a heritage angel, Natasha, and I'm glad that we can offer you this as appreciation of our of all your kindness. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, everyone. It's lovely to see you all here, and thank you for the flowers. John caught me again. He gets me every time. He rings me or emails and says, "Have you got 5 minutes on Wednesday before the meeting? Just need a word." And here we are. I don't have time to get embarrassed. Thank you ever so much. It's an absolute joy to see you all here, and hopefully we look forward to another year supporting each other and have a lovely meeting tonight. Right, thank you very much. Thank you.
So just a couple of brief announcements before moving on to our hopefully very short AGM. To remind you, first of all, at our Heritage Evening on the 15th of March, we'll have a miscellany of local culture for your enjoyment. So there'll be singing, storytelling and music, coming close to St. Patrick's Day, of course. And also I'd like to remind you to get a copy of the latest edition of Discover Portrush magazine. So we'll have those available for you on the way out. So as I said this evening, we've got a short piece of business to attend to, our annual AGM, the agenda of which has already been circulated to you. So I call on our Chair, John McNally, to conduct this short meeting. Thank you, John.
Thank you, Keith. Good evening, everybody. You're all most welcome. This will be hopefully very brief. In 2021, we became a company limited by liability. And the main reason for doing this was obviously to limit the liability arising from claims against the group. We, of course, hold insurance, but the committee felt that this was the proper way to go. So I'm pleased to say that the maximum liability for anyone in PHG is £10. The new company became operational on the 1st of January 2022, so tonight is our first annual general meeting. So item 1 on the agenda that was circulated is the adoption of the annual report, and a copy of this was sent out to everybody by email. If you haven't got a copy, if you see us at the end, I'll make sure we send you a copy in the post. So the directors met on the 25th of January and approved the annual report. Copies were circulated by email, as I've said, on the 25th of January, and the report has since been submitted to Companies House, the Charity Commission of Northern Ireland, and a return made to the Revenue Commissioners. We'd like to thank Treasurer John White for his excellent management of our finances, Jim Carrigy for his valued assistance in creating the draft schedules, and Mr. Roger Dallas, who I know is here tonight, so I'm going to embarrass him. Roger, we couldn't do it without you. Thank you very much indeed. Roger's from Irwin, Donaghy and Stockman. They have been sponsoring our organisation and supporting us since we began. We are indebted to Irwin, Donaghy, Stockman for their support over the past years. The report has been approved by the directors, and before moving the adoption of the report, I would ask if there are any comments from anyone present. Good. Thank you. Therefore, I'd like to move the adoption of the annual report. I just ask for someone to propose that. Arthur is proposing. Second. Sorry, it's been rigged. We've had a raise. Thank you. Thank you, Dorma, anyway. Okay. The appointment of directors is the second item on the agenda, or the only other item on the agenda. And in the first AGM of the new company, all the directors have to resign, and they can then offer themselves for re-election. The following former directors have agreed to put their names forward to stand again and serve as directors in 2023. John Moore, William McNall, Keith Brown, Jade Thorne, Claire Rainey, Mervyn Mackay, Jim Cavaliers, Canon John McKechnie, John White, and John McNally. Sheila Ferrian has decided not to stand again. I'd like to thank Sheila, I know she's here also, for her contribution to the success of the Heritage Group. She's also acted as unpaid photographer and minute secretary over the past years. Thank you, Sheila, for your contribution.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to work with such a successful group, and thanks to my colleagues that I work with. It was good. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. We have one new nomination for directorship, and I'd ask our Vice Chair, John Moore, for this proposal.
In accordance with Clause 36(2) of the Memorandum and Articles of Association, I wish to propose the nomination of Mr. Ken Good as the director. Notice of my intention was signed by myself and Mr. Good, and was passed to the chairman in good time.
Thank you, John. I don't think we need a seconder, but I will second that if necessary. We don't see there's a problem there. Kenneth is no stranger to us all, and in fact gave a very interesting presentation at our last Heritage Evening. Kenneth, thank you for agreeing to stand. Your contribution to the Heritage Group will be much valued and appreciated. I therefore propose the appointment of the aforementioned names as directors of Portrush Heritage Group. Could I have a seconder, please? Anyone? Ian McMillan. Okay. Thank you. That completes the annual general meeting, and I pass back to our evening chair.
Thank you, John. So, I'd like to introduce our first speaker for this evening, Mr. Edward Montgomery. Edward was born in County Antrim and educated in Northern Ireland and England. He graduated from Oxford University in History and Modern Languages in 1982, and he then attended the Royal Military Academy at Sandhurst and was commissioned as an officer in the Queen's Royal Irish Hussars, reaching the rank of captain. Since 1966, Edward has been the representative in Ireland, and since 2012 also the secretary for the Honourable The Irish Society, a property-owning, grant-making charity linking the City of London to County Londonderry. The Society uses the income from its assets to fund over 100 cross-community projects each year. And in this connection, we at Portrush Heritage Group were grateful recipients of £1,000 grant towards the cost of staging our Royal Connection exhibition in the White House window during the Swell Festival in October. I must admit, I never thought I'd be doing window dressing in the lighthouse, but there we are. Edward is responsible for all the Society's day-to-day activities and operations, including its London office, and liaises closely with its trustees, who are drawn from the City of London Corporation. He was Sheriff of County Antrim in 2003, Deputy Lieutenant of County Antrim in 2005, and received the MBE for services to the community of County Londonderry in 2014. Edward, we very much look forward to hearing your views about the Society. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman and Mr. Chairman. And good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for that very generous introduction. The first thing I should say, I know some people in the audience know me all too well, so I'll skip over some of the other things that have hopefully been said. Perhaps I could have our first slide up, please, Stuart. So the first thing is the Honourable The Irish Society, and you'll think that's a pretty strange and outlandish name, but it's not actually the full, proper legal name of the Society. It's actually the Society of the Governor and Assistants London of the New Plantation in Ulster within the realm of Ireland. So that's what the solicitors like us to put on our leases and things like that. So you can imagine how difficult that is in the computer era. So, and the next question is going to be, what is the Irish Society? So just first of all, though, our coat of arms, which I always try and show there, it shows a very splendid unification of the Tyrone-Ulster area with the red hand and the City of London arms, which is the Cross of St George with the city sword in the corner. Could I have the next slide, please? And trying to explain what the Society is, although Keith has just done it quite succinctly, I find it has to be explained as one very long sentence. But basically, it is a charity. We've modernised over the years, and we've moved from being essentially a plantation vehicle, or if you like, a colonising vehicle for the Crown, to being something I hope very, very different, and that is a charity that works for the benefit of local communities. We now, in fact, don't just cover County Londonderry, we cover the whole of the Causeway Coast and Glens area, and the whole of the Derry City and Strabane Council area, and a good chunk of the Mid-Ulster area. So we're a sort of northwest charity, broadly speaking, and as I sometimes say, we can give grants from Castledurg to Cushendall. Anyway, next slide, please. Bit of history. You'll all be very familiar with the map of the northern part of the island. The county in yellow was the last county to be created, Londonderry, created by King James I and his advisors on the conquest of the Earls and the flight of the Earls to Europe, who had been in a long-time rebellion against the English crown. And this was in the very early 17th century. Very shortly after the Grand Spanish Armada expedition, and I think a lot of the thought processes that governed the actions of the Crown then were driven by the fear of a repeat of the Spanish Armada. So what you had at the time was an uncoordinated colonisation coming counties Antrim and down, and the Crown decided that further west, where the great sea entries like Lough Swilly, Lough Foyle and the Bann, you needed something a little bit more solid and dependable from the Crown's point of view to defend those areas. So they identified that as a key back door that another Spanish Armada might use. And therefore the area which is now Londonderry and of course Coleraine on the River Bann were identified as key sort of stopping points for any invasion fleet. So those were key areas that had to be garrisoned. You can see were being assigned in a fairly ad hoc manner to different undertakers, or if you like, lead colonists. Some other organisations, such as Trinity College Dublin, which was already established as a university by the 17th century, they were also granted areas of land. But County Londonderry was hived off, and the Crown decides to give it to the City of London. Can I have the next slide, please? And the City of London was in those days made up of 55 livery companies or guilds. Some of those guilds were already 400 or 500 years old and were quite wealthy from their control of the trade in their particular industry since the Middle Ages. And they owned land and valuable property in and around London. Their members often were wealthy businessmen. And the Crown saw them as an easy source of effectively finance for their aims. And their aim was, as I said, to colonise this final part of Ireland, the last part in the jigsaw from the Crown's point of view. So how did they colonise County Londonderry? Well, if you look at that map, it looks all over the place. And that's really because the mapping and simply didn't exist. There were no roads. The area was largely wooded at the time. Sadly, that's all but disappeared. And you also had the Roman Catholic Church, which controlled very large areas of land, which was something the Crown hadn't really foreseen. So the grants of land that were given to the individual livery companies, and the 12 biggest companies of the 55 took a stake each. And you have the names there like grocers and goldsmiths, ironmongers and so on. And they all took an area of land, usually denoted by townland boundaries, because that was the only known boundary of land at the time. But the English map makers had completely muddled up what an Irish acre was and what an English acre was, and they're quite different. And it ended up with a very under-resourced plantation. But you can see how it sort of came to pass. The Irish Society itself decided as the governing body, which was it started out as the committee of the livery companies, and then it got legs of its own because the committee decided that it couldn't give a place like Londonderry, a town, to 55 different competing organisations. It had to govern it as one. So the Irish Society came into its own with its own royal charter and its own grant of assets from the Crown. Could I have the next slide, please? And just to run through what these early settlements might have looked like, and very helpfully you have these picture maps that were done, beautiful maps, they still exist. The Drapers Company have a set of them in London. I saw the originals along with the Mayor of Coleraine about 18 months ago. And they show the settlements that were built, and you see these lovely half-timbered houses which were very much on an English design and pattern that were erected. And this is actually, I think, the Salters at Mahrefelt and at Salterstown. You can see the ruins of Salterstown, which is the structure with the two towers off to the top right in that picture map. The ruins of that are still there beside Loch Ney, if you ever want to see it. It's in somebody's yard. But there's no trace, and sadly, as far as I know, anywhere of the half-timbered houses. They were all destroyed over the centuries by war and just by decay. But one or two of the major settlements, such as Mahrefelt, still continue to exist. So that was the Salters. Next slide, please. Moving slightly up the scale, the Irish Society invested very large amounts of money in building two fortified towns. The first one, of course, Coleraine, just up the inland from us here, and you'll all be very familiar with it. And this is a very interesting map, again from the early 17th century, around 1620, and it shows the very early development of Coleraine. You've got a town with a moat, or walls, or ramparts, a wooden bridge thrown across the ban, and the actual street design is actually just as it is today, the central part of Coleraine, so it's quite accurate. However, it is a work of fiction. Because this was designed to be sent to King James I to show him how the Londoners were doing what Your Majesty ordered. The wooden bridge wasn't actually built for another century, for instance. Another interesting detail that apparently demonstrates that they were trying to curry favour with the king was the curious structure on the mill burn off to the left of the picture. For those of you who wonder what that is, it's actually a ducking stool for witches. And anyone who knows anything about James I knows that he was an expert in demonology and witchcraft. And if you wanted to demonstrate your bona fides with the king, you showed that you were on top of the witch problem. So Coleraine was sorting its witches out back in 1620. The town, the interesting bit is in the script on the right, which you can't read. It tells you how many armed men were available to defend this very extensive defensive perimeter. It was about 100. It couldn't have been defended. Coleraine was a good example of how under-resourced the whole plantation was. The city and the livery companies were not men of war, they were men of commerce. And they didn't expect to have to come to Coleraine and build these great fortifications. But gradually, bit by bit, they improved. Next slide, please. And here is the sort of finished article, of course, is Londonderry. A larger city. It says in the Royal Charter that it had to have room for 400 houses inside stone walls. And the Irish Society did just that. So they built those stone walls. It took 5 years for them to be built. It cost about a fifth of the entire money for the plantation. So the money kept running out and they kept having to go to the livery companies and ask for more money. The livery companies didn't like being asked for more money, and until they coughed up, the king had some of the masters of the companies sent to the Tower of London as sort of hostages. So that can't have been much fun for them. But you can see again the street layout in Londonderry is exactly as it is today, the cruciform plan. Apparently it was a design on a French city called Vitry-le-François, which is somewhere in the Marne Valley, and had been built a few decades earlier. Again, a very defensible site had been chosen on a hill overlooking the River Foyle with a bog to the rear. That's now, of course, the bog side. And it was felt to be an ideal place to be able to stop a French or Spanish fleet sailing up the Foyle and invading. Next slide, please. And the first 20 years of the plantation was the sort of a story of difficulties, initial rebellions by the local Irish, of course, who immediately saw their land being seized off them. And the problem was that they couldn't attract settlers. There was a huge area was involved. Resources were always insufficient. Communications were appalling. So if you wanted to send a message from Coleraine, you either had to go by ship or you sent a very brave man on a horse through to Carrickfergus, where Lord Deputy Chichester, who was no friend of the City of London because he felt that he should have been given some of the assets they had been given, he would open the correspondence and send his own version off to London. And then, of course, they employed people who turned out to be absolute rascals. One or two of their agents simply fleeced them and leased property to themselves, and so on. And the most formidable one of all was Sir Thomas Phillips, who was already here, an Elizabethan soldier, come adventurer, settled in Limavady, had grants of land around Toome, and also founded Bushmills Distillery amongst his many other accomplishments. A very interesting man who somebody should write a biography of, I always think. And he managed to get on the wrong side of the Irish Society very, very quickly, even though it might have been him who had the idea of getting the City of London involved. Once he saw himself losing land to the Crown, he became its enemy, and he lived for a long time, 20 years after the plantation. He was still writing to the king, and all his letters have survived, complaining about the Londoners and what they hadn't done. The main charge he put against them was that they hadn't ethnically cleansed the local Catholic Irish off the land. And thank goodness they didn't. But that was a charge, and eventually the Crown's hostility led to a confiscation. So, next slide, please. And this is, by this time we're at about 1638, 1640. The plantation was confiscated by Charles I. But then he ran into much bigger problems. He'd alienated Parliament already. He'd now alienated the City of London by confiscating their Irish estate. And then he had to face the Civil War, which he eventually lost, and he lost his head. The plantation in Ulster had been confiscated, but was re-granted to the city by Cromwell. But that wasn't good enough, of course, because after 1661, Charles II came to the throne, and he decided to re-grant. He didn't regard Cromwell's grant as being legal in any shape or form, so he re-granted the title to the City of London. So all should have been well. However, there were 3 sieges of Londonderry and at least 1 siege of Coleraine as well. The walls of Derry did withstand all three sieges. The first two are little known about, and of course the famous one towards the end of the 18th century. The cannon on the walls, there's a picture of one there, that's Roaring Meg, which is one of the vintners' cannon, one of the 23 livery cannon that are still on the walls of Derry to this day. They were sent in 1642 at the time of the first siege, when the inhabitants of Derry realised that their wonderful walls had absolutely no guns to defend them. So they sent over to England, and of course the English were just getting going on their own civil war at the time, and didn't want to send the best weapons. It's a bit like arming Ukraine with old tanks. So they sent some Tudor-era cannon, some of them have the Tudor rose on them still, and have been dated back to the sort of 1550s. They probably weren't much good by 1640, but they were sent anyway, and they're still on the walls to this day. Next slide, please. After all these wars and things, there was a bit of a pause for breath in the 18th century in terms of the Irish Society and its associated livery companies. They start to develop infrastructure, but their leasing structure was very inefficient. They tended to lease to the local rich person, and that person either did or didn't. And the people in London got very little money from them, and they had almost no control at all over what happened. But a number of things that were good did happen. The first free school for poor children was opened in Coleraine in 1705. We think that was the Irish Society primary school. At least we trace I say because I'm a governor, our heritage from there. There were lots of difficulties through the 18th century. The South Sea Bubble, which was a major financial crash in 1720, that affected the ability of the Irish Society to sell their salmon to London, believe it or not. And they actually at that time decided to send a ship loaded with salmon all the way to Venice. Goodness knows what the salmon tasted like by the time it got to Venice. But the ship actually hit a rock and sank just short of Venice, but they still salvaged some of the salmon, so there you are, they never gave up. One thing they did give up there was the forestry, the rights to the forestry, which had been granted under the Royal Charter. The Irish Society decided it simply couldn't stop people cutting down trees willy-nilly as the countryside was gradually cleared and farms were established. And it's hard to imagine what that countryside would have looked like today, of course. The ability to run church livings, which was the ability to appoint ministers of the established church, that was extremely valuable, potentially, but that had been lost. The local bishops had grabbed that. And there were endless battles with the corporations of Londonderry and the corporation of Coleraine over who owned what. Next slide, please. In the 19th century, the Irish Society decided enough was enough. One of them came over, did a survey, a report, went back to London and said, if you don't catch yourselves on, this is all going to go. So they decided to start sending deputations from London, and this is just after the Napoleonic Wars. And luckily, they produced every year a lovely written report, and we still have them all. And they're very detailed. They came over, they saw, they stayed, they didn't mince their words about what they thought of people. They thought the Irish lived in disgusting, mean hovels most of the time. They were very against thatched roofs. They wanted everything slated. They wanted good buildings done. And they were imbued with a philanthropy that had really caught on in London in the 1820s and 1830s, when you had penal reform and all kinds of improvements were being pushed through society. So the City of London did bring some good benefits with it. And the livery companies also had an era where they took more control over the leases to their tenants. Most of them in the 1820s grabbed back control from the local middleman. And you find that a lot of towns, like, say, Draperstown, as one example, was built during that era, and you have wonderful public buildings, pharmacies, corn stores, a courthouse, and all kinds of dwellings are being built. And I always think it's very ironic that the 19th century is when they're doing their best work, and then they're very shortly going to be taken out of the picture altogether. So, next slide, please. Some of the public buildings that the Irish Society built in Londonderry and Coleraine, the two most significant ones, of course, are the two town halls, the Guildhall in Londonderry. I think it's the only Guildhall in Ireland, I might be wrong. recently refurbished by the council, and I think it's looking very magnificent again. It's got a wonderful livery company donated windows in it, and if anyone hasn't been there, I'd urge you to do that. The town hall in Coleraine, that's actually the second one that was built by the Society. Those of you who follow the ups and downs of these things may have noted last year that we actually transferred it to the council, which we'd never got round to doing in 1859. When it was built, due to the religious revival that was happening at the time. It seems that everybody kind of slightly lost their bearings and forgot to sign off on the town hall. So we had a message from the lawyers last year saying, could you please decide whether you own the town hall or not? So anyway, it is now belongs to the Causeway Council. Next slide, please. And the great visits from London continued through the 19th century and into the 20th century. And by the 20th century, they'd become very grand affairs indeed. And here is the full team come over from London, including the governor sitting front centre, Sir Alfred Newton, and his wife, who apparently was very formidable, standing behind him. And you had the butler, their various attendants, and lots of bigwigs. And Sir Alfred Newton was actually governor for about 15 years. He's the only governor so far that has been murdered, however, whilst governor. He was poisoned in a real Agatha Christie style outside Harrods, the department store in London, where he was chairman amongst his many business interests. And apparently the driver, his chauffeur, opened the door and he fell dead onto the pavement in a dramatic manner. It turned out that his maid had inadvertently put strychnine in his heart medicine that morning, and nobody knows where that came from to this day. I've met his great-grandson a few years ago, and he said, nope, we still don't know. He'd made a lot of enemies. He was a self-made man from Lincolnshire, had worked his way up through the insurance world in the City of London, trodden on a lot of toes, and apparently had quite a lot of enemies, but nobody ever got done for it, as they say. So I'm sure there's one for Ian McGee to put his undoubted abilities to. Next slide, please. The visitations are slightly smaller now. In the old days, they used to stay at the building bottom left, which is in Bishop Street, next to the courthouse in Londonderry. And the bedrooms up on the top floor, there are about 6 bedrooms there, and the visitors from London would stay there for a number of days while they conducted their affairs and reviewed the city. Following a major bombing in 1988, the courthouse, our offices were too badly damaged. My predecessor, Commander Peter Campbell, moved the whole show up to Coleraine, where Cutts House, luckily for them, was standing empty, having just come back to the Society at the end of a long lease. If you haven't been there, you're very welcome to pay a visit. Just ring us and let me know. It's on the Ban at Castle Road, just outside Coleraine, just upstream of Coleraine, opposite where the long lost and lamented pub, the Salmon Leap, used to stand. Cutts House is a rather more modest building, but we have 3 bedrooms there. The trustees stay there. We have a boardroom, and our offices are there, and I think it works very well. Next slide, please. The 20th century saw further change as the Irish Society. In the 19th century, as I said, the livery companies were doing good work, building things, doing good stuff. So was the Irish Society. But the Land Act that arrived through a process started by Gladstone when he was Prime Minister in 1868, 1870, culminated by all the livery companies as absentee landowners having to surrender their estates and sell their estates. They were all paid off quite well, I think, so they withdrew. The very last one, in fact, the Mercer's Company, who owned Kilray and a lot of land around it, they actually didn't go entirely until the 1960s. But most of them had gone by the time of the First World War. The Irish Society lost its own farmland around Derry and Coleraine, but it retained its urban property, and therefore it had enough to continue in existence. It also owned fisheries which weren't affected by the Land Acts. However, the foil fisheries became the border between Derry and Strabane on the foil after partition in 1921, and that turned out to be, for the next 20 years, an extremely difficult area for the Irish Society to manage a fishery where one part of it lay in what was essentially a foreign country. And of course they weren't particularly friendly at that time. In the late 40s, early 50s, a court case was taken in Dublin. The Irish Society lost, but anarchy on the foil fisheries was not a good thing from either the Dublin government or the Northern government's point of view, so they did a joint buyout of the Irish Society and actually set up the first cross-border body, the Foil Fisheries Commission, in 1952. We retained some fishing rights on the foil, but the right of commercial netting for salmon had gone. The Derry Walls, another massive asset, put into Northern Ireland government guardianship in 1955. But I still attend management committee meetings and we deal with issues affecting the walls. Mainly, thank goodness, now they're seen as very positive for tourism. And the Troubles, of course, was also a very difficult era for the City of London and the Irish Society. Very low profile in the 70s and 80s and into the 90s. I always say that really the opportunity, when I started in 1996, of course the peace process was already underway, and after 1998 and the Good Friday Agreement, it was much easier to start reconnecting with London and starting to get the livery companies back involved again. Next slide, please. Just a very quick shot of the fisheries, because they remain an important but not over-important asset of the Irish Society. The era of letting out the fisheries to the local highest bidder ended in the 1980s. We run the fisheries ourselves, but we delegate local management to angling clubs. We've got 16 angling clubs from here to almost to Ardstraw, with leases of river to manage, so local people have management of their own fishing rights. We run the River Bann, on the other hand, directly with our own staff, our own patrol boats and our own efforts. One of the things I'm looking at the minute is another environmental program to try and look after litter clearance on the Bann estuary. It's utterly appalling, I think, at the moment. But it's a significant asset. The Society is undoubtedly the biggest private fishery owner in Northern Ireland and probably in Southern Ireland too. Next slide, please. Just a quick shot. You'll recognise the bar mouth from this aerial shot, and of course a bit of Portrush Golf Club. The two moles that go out into the sea were built by the Society in the 1870s and 1880s to try and improve navigation for ships coming into the Bann. Of course, the Bann is a navigable waterway. Next slide, please. Fishing further up the river around Mavanaher and Carnroe weirs, you'll still get some wonderful trout like the one top left, and some very, very good salmon fishing is still to be had at Carnroe, but it's all rod and line fishing, and it's all done on a sustainable basis. You have to catch and release alive, unharmed, salmon and sea trout. Next slide, please. And we bailiff the river, and that's a slightly younger me talking to our bailiffs up at Toome before they were all heading out on a night patrol on one of our little boats. And the Bann is nearly 40 miles long, so there's a lot of water to look after there. I'd like to think, touch wood, that we've got a fair grip of it, and that poaching isn't as difficult a problem as it was perhaps 50 years ago, and it's certainly not as bad as it is still on the River Foyle. Next slide, please. Our governance and structure, the Society is still governed by its most recent 17th century charter, but thank goodness we modernised it about 10 years ago. We've got a new royal charter from Queen Elizabeth, which is a wonderful document, and it sets out the various things that we have to do. The membership, or trustee membership, is still very much the City of London, elected members who are then elected by the City onto the committee. A governor who's always a past Lord Mayor, current one is Sir William Russell. Some of his colleagues serve as trustees. They meet regularly. I go over to see them in the Guildhall every 3 or 4 months, and of course they come here on regular visits. Next slide, please. What do I do in the meantime? Pretty much what you've been told already, I think, there, so we can move on to the next slide, please. And that is a picture. I know Norman is with us, and of course he's served on our committee for a good many times in the past. The Local Advisory Committee, I think one of the best things that my predecessor did in the 70s at the height of the Troubles was to try and make the Society more accountable locally. Its charitable function was therefore to be scrutinised and controlled by local members rather than people in London trying to decide who should get a grant and who shouldn't. As I think was mentioned, we give over 120 grants each year. We're heading this year for just over $250,000 for the first time in direct grants going back into the community. But we're only as big as our assets, so the property, the fisheries, and our investments, that's where the funding comes from. We don't get government grants, and we don't shake tins around and ask people to donate. We I think, are reasonably effective in a local area. And the committee is also composed of all political parties. All the main parties are currently represented on our charity committee. Next slide, please. A lot of our grants go into education. We support not just the local primary schools that bear the Society's historical name in Coleraine or in Londonderry, but other schools. Sandalford Special Needs School, for instance, there on the bottom. That's a presentation that we were doing there some years ago. In fact, we're heading there again in about 10 days' time. St Mary's College in Derry, top left there, who do a joint project with Lisneal College, and we help them with their after-school projects every year, and we've been doing that for at least 15 years now. So lots and lots of small or large educational grants. Next slide, please. The charitable criteria are quite straightforward, and I'm sure many of you here may have applied as members of groups in the past. It's pretty broad. The grants aren't enormous, £1,000 to £2,000 mostly, but they're designed to try and help community groups or organisations buy a piece of equipment or carry out a project, and you can keep coming back every 3 years. So I'm sure John will have remembered that. Next slide, please. We've managed to draw in some of the livery companies back in as well. Some of them just come on visits, and I've had so many of them over the years, not just a few mentioned at the top there, like the weavers and the girdlers, but many others as well. The drapers and the cloth workers especially give us grants to spend on their behalf locally, and that's extremely good. Currently we're getting, I think, 70,000 a year from those two companies alone. And that's actually the master draper modelling stewards' jerseys for the GAA at Owen Begg, just outside Dungiven, a couple of years ago. So some interesting and new ground has been broken, I think, there. And we're still encouraging as many more of the livery companies to become re-involved again. Merchant tailors, for instance, support Foyle College. I guess there might be somebody here who went to Foyle College and may already know that. The Salters have a fund supporting Magherafelt that we contribute to. And it says there at the bottom there are there are 110 livery companies today. So the number has actually doubled exactly since 1613. And those livery companies, many of them are very modern in outlook. We have information technologists, for instance. And we're always trying to find ways, and I try and get my trustees in London who are all members of livery companies, to work where they can and find new ways of trying to bring what they have there over here. Next slide, please. And there's this whole networking side to the Society, which makes it a very unusual charity. And that's when the City of London, when the Lord Mayor of the City of London, in that case it was Sir Charles Bowman, and he's there with John Boyle, the Mayor of Derry, about 4 years ago. And some of you may recognise some of the politicians there. I can assure you there's DUP, Sinn Féin, SDLP, there's Ulster University also there, and business strongly represented. And those meetings are very useful. Financial services is what the Lord Mayor of London does. That's his ambassadorial job. It's not Sadiq Khan. That's a very different sort of mayoralty. The Lord Mayor of the City of London travels the world during his or her year in office, selling UK financial services overseas. They spend a lot of time on their travels. Very popular when they come here. We had the current Lord Mayor, Nicholas Lyons, was in Belfast at the end of November. His very first trip as Lord Mayor. They're only elected every November. And he also came to Londonderry and met a number of financial services businesses there, especially ones which are looking to connect to the City of London, which, as everybody knows, is a very large financial centre. Next slide, please. almost there. This is just one I use. One of our former governors, Ian Luder, in our 400th anniversary year with the Mayor of Derry, Martin Riley, celebrating the 400 years of history between the two organisations. Final slide, please. So I think it's the final one. Yeah. So I always try and conclude by saying, how is it that the society has managed to survive over 400 years? I really don't know, to be perfectly honest. But it does. It has an ability to adapt, and the City of London is always at the cutting forefront. I mean, I noticed that the trustees over my time have become a lot more diverse. We have a lot more female members of the trustee board, and it continues to evolve and change. And their views on things and what they want to achieve as a charity will also continue to evolve as well. But I think it's still it's a totally unique link. There isn't anything like this in Scotland or Wales or anywhere else, as far as I'm aware. And the city regards Northern Ireland as something very close to it. In case I've encouraged anybody to want to look further into the history of the Irish Society, I've brought a couple of boxes of our history book with me. This is where I go into sales patter. It's a large book. We printed it about 20 years ago as a Millennium project. Remember the Millennium? It was a long time ago, 23 years ago now. And we've still got a few copies of it left, and I can offer it to you for the knockdown sum of £20, which is a lot less than it says on the flyleaf. And if anybody wants afterwards, I'd be very happy to autograph a copy for them. And finally, if I'm allowed, Mr. Chairman, can I ask for any questions? Or?
Yes, do you want to do that?
Yep. I've probably run over time, so if anyone has any questions, I'll try and answer them. Oh, there is one. Yes? Mm-hmm. Yep. I think. Well, we want to see it developed for leisure, but it has to be done sustainably. You can't just plonk moorings down willy-nilly on the river. The harbour commissioners have ultimate legal control over navigation on the estuary, which is where most of the moorings and jetties and marinas tend to be. I doubt there's room for a fourth marina. There are 3 currently there at the time. We have a number of moorings around where the railway bridge crosses the river, but I'm always very careful to connect with the harbour commissioners if somebody approaches us seeking a new mooring. But I never say no if I can help it, because it adds a little bit to the diversified interests of the society to have another mooring or whatever. But I think salmon fishing, which was a staple for the Irish Society for 300 years, the plight of the Atlantic salmon is probably well known to most of the people here. The numbers have crashed. We had a seminar a couple of months ago in Coleraine, and a very eminent scientist, Irish scientist, told me that we're down to about 30% of the salmon in the North Atlantic that we had 30 years ago. That's not getting any better. And therefore it behoves the society to look at other ways of making income where it can from the river ban, and moorings and marinas and possibly renewable energy development are the sort of areas that we need to look at. Okay, right, in that case I think we're done, Chairman.
Thank you very much, Edward, for that very interesting talk. And I think we're extremely lucky in this neck of the woods to have this connection, having spent quite a lot of my working life in the City of London, to have this connection with the city through the Irish Society. So thank you very much. So I'd like to move on to our second speaker, and he's no stranger to most of the people in this room, Mr. John McNally. He's been our chair since the formation of the Heritage Group in 2014. A little bit of background about John. He was an employee for almost 50 years of BKS Surveys, which is the Korean-based aerial surveying and mapping company. And John has travelled extensively supporting BKS operations in over 40 countries. so a busy passport for you, John. He's a former director and flight operations manager of BKS Survey Flights and was the company's sales manager for over 30 years. For some of you, perhaps more importantly, he's perhaps recognised locally as a former owner with his brother-in-law John Campbell of the Harbour Bar and the Harbour Inn. So John's talk this evening will be about a very ambitious series of planning proposals for Portrush, which were prepared in 1944, which is quite remarkable considering what was going on in 1944, by the Portrush Urban District Council Town Planning Architect, Charles Aliaga Kelly. Over to you, John.
Thank you, Keith. I struggled with the title for this. If you put my first slide up there, if you don't mind, Stuart. Yeah, I struggled with the title for this, and I eventually got guidance from Hugh McGrattan, and Hugh came up with the idea of this title in particular. I had thought of the Kelly Report, and then Hugh thought, being a newspaper man doing headlines, he thought, what about the Portrush that might have been? So thank you, Hugh. It keeps us all thinking about what's going to happen next. It really says a lot about the passion, pride, vision and sense of belonging that the former Portrush Urban District Councillors had for Portrush. And I'd also like to mention, just before I get into my talk, that Francis Wilson's newsletter 62 on Captain Shutt and 77 on the Portrush Urban District Council, and Robert Corbett's newsletter on H.A. McNally and prominent Portrush men. You can access all of these newsletters in our website. First slide, I think. Next slide. So on the 1st of December 1982, Portrush held its first election and appointed 15 town commissioners. H.A. McNally of Fallata House was the first chairman. The town commissioners existed for 6 years when the electorate were again asked to elect councillors for the newly formed Portrush Urban District Council. Okay, next slide. In 1923, the Portrush Urban District Council appointed Captain W.R. Shutt as the entertainment officer. He was a great athlete, playing football, tennis, cricket and rugby, as well as being a proficient boxer and horse rider. And during the First World War, he served in the Royal Warwickshire Regiment and was awarded the Military Cross for bravery. In that same year, the recreation grounds opened on the 29th of June, and in his article, that's Hughes, in the Discover Portrush magazine, he's mentioned that the ambitious recreation ground scheme embarked upon by the Urban Council, only after much debate, proved to be one of the most successful projects carried out by the local authority. It provided a base for the many activities which were to be hallmarks of Portrush holidays for the next 80 years. Indeed, even today, without the recreation grounds, it's hard to envisage a Portrush. So Captain Shutt facilitated entertainment of many kinds, such as carnivals, concerts, fireworks displays, aquatic events, military tattoos, sports such as sailing regattas, tennis and bowling weeks were also introduced, and there was a large number of entrants. During the Second World War, there were restrictions to development. However, the council view was that a demand for leisure occupation in one form or the other already existed and was likely to increase after the war was over. However, one of the main features which Portrush as a seaside town resort lacked, and which should be supplied, was a first-class swimming pool. So in August 1943, Portrush Urban District Council appointed a Mr. Charles Aliaga Kelly as town planner for Portrush at a salary of £450 per annum. Portrush was the first council on instructions from the Ministry of Home Affairs to appoint a planning officer, and the council chairman, Mr. A. Stewart, stated that by the time the others got going, Portrush would be 1 year ahead. Mr. Kelly was instructed by the council to produce a development plan for Portrush. To put this into context, in December 1943, so August he was appointed, in December the US 1st Airborne Brigade, consisting of 507 and 508 parachute infantry regiments, started to arrive on the North Antrim coast to prepare for D-Day. The 507 was with approximately 2,004 men were billeted within Portrush town, and the 508 with approximately 2,056 were billeted in Camp Cremore on the outskirts of Port Stewart. Both regiments moved out on the 11th of March 1944 and headed for final D-Day preparations in England. D-Day took a terrible toll on the troopers stationed in Portrush and Port Stewart. We owe them so much. In compelling his report, Mr. Kelly made regular intermediate reports to Council in September and November of 1943 and in February 1944. The preliminary proposals contained in the final document were presented to the Council in May 1944, almost 80 years ago. It ran to 64 pages and contained 81 proposals. Our Heritage Vice Chair John Moore had a copy of the text in the report, but the important accompanying document supporting plans and maps eluded us. That is until I approached Kerry Gregg, who, as he said, inverted commas, thought he had a copy of the Kelly report. Well, true to form, Kerry produced a copy of the Kelly report, and I'm grateful to him for allowing us access to it with its maps and reports in the back. Next slide. The plans had suffered a bit with age and with the help of historian Armstrong, whose work features regularly in our exhibitions. The faded isometric drawing of the main proposals has been brought to life. The 64-page report, published, as I said, almost 80 years ago, and as mentioned, contains 81 recommendations, and I've had to select a few of the more ambitious proposals for this talk. Before, I must quote from Mr. Kelly's introduction in the report. It is a mistake to imagine the planning proposals to be a vast scheme of works, which is to be carried out at one time and in which the cost can be determined beforehand. Basically, planning is merely forethought. For instance, if a new swimming pool is to be built to the rear of the South Pier, it is merely ordinary planning to avoid building now on this site. So some of the text describing Mr. Kelly's recommendations, some of my text, is taken directly from the report. This is the first, one of the proposals, not the first. This is the Quarry Coal Sheds, it's called. This is a space once occupied with the coal yards and the RAF base, which later became the Yacht Club and is currently Waterworld. Mr. Kelly proposes to clear the entire space and goes on to say, the quarry is to be divided into two portions. One, the northern end to be used for storing coal and goods, and the southern end to be designed as a combined recreational building for the town in its wildest sense. That's what it means. The coal would be stored in a reinforced concrete building or bins of several stories. The recreational building would be of 3 stories with the ground floor, open-air cafe or beer garden fronting onto the bandstand area. It would be on columns so that the effect of the space would flow through the building. Nice one here now. Exciting views over the sea to Inishowen would be obtained by piercing tunnels in the rock and filling them with sheets of armour-plated glass so that the wind and spray would be kept out. All right. Very considerate. So Quarry Court is the next one. Well, for those who don't know where Quarry Court is, I've just put this slide up. It's located behind Neptune and Prawn, and the houses were owned by the Gregg family. It was originally known as Albert Place and then later as Quarry Court. There's a row of houses in the place or court, and after the residents left, my father had his workshop in one of them, and then the garage was just across here on the other side. I kept my car. So this is a photograph of Billy and I think it's Bob Gregg in Quarry Court. Next. So for Quarry Court, Mr. Kelly is proposing that it must be rebuilt as the houses are old and out of date. In this case, the houses fronting onto Kerr Street must be considered as well. It is therefore proposed that all the area from the houses opposite the air raid shelter, and I can find no reference to that, to opposite the lifeboat house should be treated as one area for clearance and rebuilding. A new connection between the corner of Mark Street, coming down from Mark Street, and the harbour by means of a staircase down the cliff should be incorporated into the scheme. It is suggested that the houses should be laid out in a semicircle with a central open grass patch planted with suitable trees on which fishing nets could be spread for drying or repairs and where children could play without running onto the street. Everybody got their bearings on that one. So the next one is called Remore Head Steps and Undercliff Promenade. Mr. Kelly, this is our Goblins, by the way. Mr. Kelly proposes to provide two good means of access down the plateau running on the west side of the cliffs on Remore Head and to provide a pathway between them. And he states, if a step just at the lookout and another at a point near the quarry, it is possible to have 350 yards of flat path of the plateau. Alternative as a more exciting method of access for visitors, a short tunnel, he's quite keen on those, could be cut through the rock from the quarry. The sheer cliffs facing directly southwest and give shelter for most of the cold winds and well, I thought the winds were westerly actually. Anyway, furthermore, the rock face, by absorbing and radiating the sun's heat, makes the place warm even on a cool day. And there's an additional recommendation. He says, it has been suggested that a Camera Obscura would be an attraction for tourists if it was built on top of Remore Head, and visitors could enter it by paying a nominal charge and watch the different views. The building should be of simple design and preferably faced or built with local stone so as to blend in. Next one. Low-level promenade and landing facilities. In recommendation number 11, Mr. Kelly states, there appears to be considerable inconvenience caused in the harbour both to fishermen and pleasure boat users by the lack of easy access for getting aboard boats. It is therefore proposed that a low-level promenade, 20 feet wide, be built along the north-east side of the harbour. The promenade would run from the western edge of the old dock, where it would connect with the pier level, as far as the slip by the beach in the east corner of the harbour. A small pier could run out at one point of the deeper water so that larger boats would be accessible from this promenade. Quite a clever move there. The old dock. I think this is one the Heritage Group is definitely going to have an issue with, but anyway, we'll read it. The old dock, which was originally the harbour for Portrush, is now useless. The entrance is blocked by a railway bridge, which is old, unsafe for locomotives, and is seldom used. The water is too shallow at low tide, and the bridge clearance is insufficient to permit boats of any size or with masts to use it. Furthermore, there are only 2 poor flights of stone steps down to the water. The dock faces south and is exposed to the sun from early morning. It's well sheltered, and it covers about half an acre. Accordingly, it is proposed to remove the railway bridge and build a continuation of the pier wall in its place, to fill in the whole dock up to ground level, and to level off the adjoining ground so that it will form one flat area. The road around the base of the dockhead would be closed and a new roadway made on the site of the old railway bridge. The dock could be laid out as a type of open-air theatre so that seats could be laid around for musical recitals or variety shows on summer evenings. In the layout of the filled-in dock, it is suggested that a bandstand or open-air stage with stores and dressing rooms could be built under the dockhead. The audience in facing the stage would have the sun at their backs, therefore avoiding glare, and would be in the most sheltered open large space in Portrush. Very interesting, that one. Ring road system is another one of Mr. Kelly's proposals. There are 2 ring roads he's proposing, and with various connecting roads back into Portrush. In this slide, we see a new dual carriageway and promenade, and also a second road. So you can see where the promenade is, that's a dual carriageway running along below Barry's, and then between Barry's and the station, they've run a road underneath the station cafe running out as well, and those roads connect up with ring roads going around Portrush. It is recommended accordingly as an outline proposal only that the station square be extended on the west side as far as the outside wall of the railway station cafe. On the north side of the square, the War Memorial would be removed, he's not saying where it's moving, and the road cut back to a line 5 feet south of the present town hall. The whole area could be laid out as a roundabout for traffic. And I'm afraid on the town hall, Mr. Kelly is uncompromising. It is proposed to demolish the present town hall and to rebuild it as a more suitable and dignified building. This is a long-term proposal. It is important to realize the 2 completely different meanings of the word town hall. One is applied to the administrative centre of the town, with offices and chambers, and the second is applied to entertainment building for dances, concerts, and other functions. The present town hall combines both functions unsuccessfully. The administrative side of the town will be catered for in a new building to be erected on the site of the present building. The main town hall functions, in the second sense of the word, would be transferred to the new hall over the swimming pool and hall attached to the new school in Dundas Street. And there are 3 new schools in the report. I'm not dealing with them tonight. I have not dealing with any schools tonight. This one is perhaps Mr. Kelly's most ambitious proposal, in which he states, "It is proposed to construct at the back of the South Pier a swimming pool, providing an indoor pool of full international dimensions, an outdoor pool with a shallow end for children, facilities for bathing in the open sea, a cafe, dance hall and seating accommodation for visitors. The new swimming bath would be 165 feet long and 60 feet wide and would be graded in depth from 4 feet to 15 feet under the diving boards. It would be parallel to the South Pier, and a grandstand covering the dressing boxes would occupy the northwest and northeast sides of the bath. Outside this enclosed pool, a large open-air pool, also filled with seawater, purified, sterilised, and brackets and even warmed a few degrees if thought desirable, would be constructed, and this would also measure 180 feet by 120 feet, ranging in depth from 1 foot to 15 feet under the diving boards. So all this area would be enclosed in roofs so that at all times of the day or night or year, bathing could be carried out. The water would be seawater, warmed, filtered, and sterilised continuously, and the bathers and surrounding promenade would be heated for the comfort of the bathers. Under the bath and adjoining it would be installed the rooms for machinery. A passage would surround the water tank with panels of toughened glass in the walls so that underwater views of the bathers could be obtained, enhanced by floodlighting at night. An aquarium showing local fish could also be included. I'm not sure if they're in the pool or out of the pool. Overhanging the whole pool would be a terrace onto which would open a cafe, restaurant and a dance hall. The site is one that would capture all the midday and afternoon and evening sun and is sheltered from exposure to rough seas. Well, that's not really true, but on the seaside of the promenade enclosing the 2 pools, persons who wished could bathe in the open sea, and to ensure their safety, a groin would be erected at the southern end to deflect the strong flow and ebb current along this edge, and a floating boom anchored some distance out would prevent swimmers from unwisely venturing too far. It should be proposed to include a dance hall, a cafe, reading rooms, restrooms, cloakrooms, it's very big, together with a space in front of the entrance for parking cars. Hot seawater and medical baths might also be included. So, and in conclusion on this report, he said, or on this proposal, when the swimming pool is built, the present bathing boxes will become redundant and may be removed. The pier will then serve merely as a breakwater, but to give an object to those walking the pier, it is proposed to construct a small theatre or hall of a simple type on piles in the harbour. The hall could be let for use for reviews, dances and displays, and would be surrounded by a footway for pedestrians and would serve as a pleasant terminal for the pier. Covered lighting and illuminations could be also installed. So, ladies and gentlemen, I have picked from that report just about 5 of the 81 recommendations, and if I was to continue, you'd be here all night. But it's back one, sorry, I beg your pardon. You're right. You're right there. Okay. So really, I've just selected a few of the ones that I thought were interesting and could form another discussion about whatever you like. You know, the Causeway Tram terminus is going to be in Rory's former house garden. Where's Rory? Rory's here tonight, isn't he? Antrim House, Rory? Is that yours? Your mother's house? Your mother's house. In the garden of the Antrim House, he was proposing that it would be the new tramway terminus. I don't think he asked your mother permission, but anyway. That was that one. There was a new school on Dunluce, I mentioned that. New recreation grounds, although they'd only just been opened about 25 years earlier. New railway station and road layout. Industrial area. I mean, it is quite incredible. So, next slide. We commend the Portrush Urban District Councillors. Their names are there for you to read, really. And I think, is that a connection of yours on that? Your grandfather's a town clerk. Well, we send you to pass back to the family, or to remember our congratulations for the vision that they have shown in preparing this report. In today's terms, some of the proposals would raise concerns. However, you cannot but admire the vision demonstrated to make Portrush the leading tourist destination in Northern Ireland. To finish, I'd like to thank Roberta Knox for loaning me her collection of documents about Portrush Urban District Council. The final Portrush Urban District Council took office in May 1967, and for the Council, Wednesday the 19th of September 1973 was a day of celebration, although it was also tinged with sadness that local government would never be the same again. The day started with an interdenominational service in the Council Chamber, followed by a luncheon in this hotel, the Northern Counties, or the one before it. An afternoon buffet was in the Skerry Ban with many volunteers. However, the highlight of the day was a dinner held in Fosse's Hotel and presided over by Mr. R.G. McNally. After a sumptuous dinner, there were many toasts and tributes paid to the staff and other townspeople who had helped Portrush Urban District Council in so many ways. This is my last slide. The Council's last meeting was convened on Monday, the 24th of September 1973, that's 50 years ago, under the chairmanship of R.G. Jerry McNally. During his time as chairman, Mr. McNally had worn a chain of office which included a badge shown here designed by local artist George Little. At the end of his term, this was handed over to Coleraine Borough Council then for its archives. So what would Mr. Kelly think about Portrush today? I'll leave that to you to decide. Thank you very much.
Thank you, John. That was pretty impressive. Mr. Kelly, a man with vision. When John phoned me up when he'd heard about this report and started to describe some of the various things, such as some of the tunnelling and ambitious things that he was looking at the head, I had some trouble visualising it, but once I saw the pictures, I got it. So thank you, John. So, well, just a couple of things before we do our raffle. This is to help our friends who are live streaming this. Just a couple of things. Just please tell your friends about the Heritage Group, get them to join. It's the best value in Portrush for £10 per annum, I think. And the more members we have, the louder our heritage voice will be. So all that remains tonight is for me to thank our two speakers very much, Edward and John, and your audience, the audience for your support. We wish you a safe journey home. We wish you good luck in the draw tonight. And if you're already at home online, we'll meet again on the 15th of March. So thank you very much.